Most of what you were taught about the Korean War is wrong. The sudden invasion, the surprise South, the innocent nation attacked without warning by a communist puppet state, acting purely on Stalin's orders. It's a narrative that has been repeated in classrooms and documentaries so many times that it calcified into something resembling fact. But the truth is messier, bloodier, and far more homegrown than most people realize. For decades, the story has gone something like this. On June 25th, 1950, North Korean tanks rolled across the 38th parallel without provocation, catching a peaceful South Korea completely off guard, and triggering a Cold War proxy fight between the United States and the communist world. It's clean, it's dramatic. It fits perfectly into the good versus evil framework of the Cold War. And increasingly, declassified archives, forgotten massacres, and a wave of revisionist scholarship are pulling that story apart piece by piece. What actually happened is far more complicated. It involves two exhausted American colonels drawing a border in 30 minutes with a magazine map, tens of thousands of Koreans killed by their own government years before the war supposedly began, a Soviet dictator who said no to war for 2 straight years before finally saying yes, and a diplomatic speech that may or may not have accidentally invited an invasion. This is the story of how one of the 20th century's most consequential wars has been misremembered, and what historians got wrong along the way. Let's start with the scale of what we're actually talking about. The Korean War is often treated as a footnote sandwiched between the Second World War and Vietnam, sometimes called America's Forgotten War. But the human cost was staggering. Estimates placed total deaths, military and civilian combined, somewhere between 2 and 3 million people across a peninsula that, at the time, held a population of roughly 30 million. That means something close to 1 in every 10 Koreans, north and south, died in 3 years of fighting. Entire cities changed hands 4 or 5 times as front lines surged north to the Chinese border and then collapsed back south past Seoul. Pyongyang was leveled by American bombing campaigns so thorough that by the war's end, American commanders reported there were no significant targets left standing. Seoul was captured and recaptured so many times that its pre-war population was scattered across the peninsula as refugees. And yet, despite the scale of the devastation, the question of how this war actually began, who set it in motion, and why, remained clouded in propaganda and simplified Cold War narrative for nearly half a century. It took the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of its archives to finally start answering those questions with real evidence instead of assumption. The traditional origin story of the Korean War, the one most people absorbed through popular history, goes like this. Korea was a peaceful, if divided nation, until the morning of June 25, 1950, when the North Korean People's Army launched a surprise, unprovoked assault across the 38th parallel. This was framed almost immediately, and understandably, as naked communist aggression, a direct extension of Stalin's ambitions in Asia, similar in spirit to Hitler's invasion of Poland. President Truman himself drew that exact comparison. This interpretation, sometimes called the traditionalist view, dominated Western historiography for decades. It was reinforced by Cold War politics on both sides of the Pacific, and it had a clean moral shape. There was an aggressor and there was a victim. But here's the uncomfortable truth historians have had to grapple with. The war did not begin on June 25, 1950. That date marks the moment a civil conflict already years in the making finally exploded into full-scale internationalized war. To understand why, you have to go back 5 years earlier to a decision made not by Koreans, but by 2 American Army officers who had barely heard of the country they were about to divide. On the night of August 10, 1945, with Japan's surrender only days away and Soviet troops pouring into Korea from the north, 2 young colonels named Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel were handed an urgent assignment inside the Pentagon. They needed to propose a line that would separate an American occupation zone from a Soviet one, and they needed it fast, because Soviet forces were already on the peninsula while the nearest American troops were still 600 miles away in Okinawa. Rusk later admitted the line made no sense economically or geographically. Working late into the night with nothing more than a National Geographic wall map, the 2 men selected the 38th parallel, largely because it kept the capital, Seoul, inside the American zone and made their decision in roughly 30 minutes. No Korean leader was consulted. No Korean was even in the room. Korea had existed as a unified state for well over 1,000 years, and now it was being sliced in half by 2 exhausted staff officers who, by their own later admission, knew almost nothing about the country's geography, culture, or politics. Remarkably, when the proposal reached Moscow, Stalin agreed to it almost immediately, likely because Soviet forces were already positioned to take the entire peninsula if they'd pushed further south, and a negotiated line secured at least a Soviet sphere of influence without a fight. What both sides assumed would be a short-term administrative convenience hardened year by year into one of the most militarized borders on the planet. Here's your first retention hook, because this is where the story most people know actually starts to fall apart. If you think the Korean War began with a surprise attack in the summer of 1950, you're skipping over nearly 2 full years of bloodshed that most textbooks conveniently leave out. And what happened in those 2 years changes everything about how we should understand what came after. By 1948, 2 rival governments had solidified on either side of that hastily drawn line. Syngman Rhee, a fiercely anti-communist nationalist who had spent much of his life in exile in the United States, took power in the South with American backing. Kim Il-sung, a young guerrilla commander who had fought the Japanese occupation from bases in the Soviet Union and Manchuria, consolidated power in the North with Soviet backing. Both men claimed to be the legitimate leader of the entire Korean Peninsula. Both men wanted reunification, on their own terms, by whatever means necessary. And in the South specifically, Rhee's government spent the 2 years before the war's official start date crushing a series of uprisings with a brutality that historians are only now fully reckoning with. In April 1948, on the southern island of Jeju, residents opposed to separate elections that would formalize the division of Korea rose up against police and right-wing paramilitary groups. The immediate spark was a police crackdown on protesters that killed 6 people, prompting the local branch of the South Korean Labor Party to launch an armed resistance. What followed was not a brief skirmish. It was a scorched earth counterinsurgency campaign that lasted more than a year. Depending on the source, somewhere between 14,000 and 60,000 people were killed out of an island population of roughly 300,000. Some estimates run even higher. Whole villages were burned to the ground, and tens of thousands of survivors fled to Japan rather than remain on the island. This is now formally recognized in South Korea as a massacre, following decades of suppressed investigation. But for most of the 20th century, it barely registered as a footnote in the story of how the Korean War began, even though it happened more than 2 years before the war's official start date, and even though it was carried out by the same government, the traditional narrative later cast purely as the innocent victim of aggression. The violence didn't stop there. That same October, soldiers in the port city of Yosu, ordered to deploy to Jeju and help suppress the uprising, mutinied instead. Many sympathized with the leftist cause. The rebellion spread quickly into the neighboring city of Sunshin, with soldiers and civilian sympathizers seizing local government buildings and executing officials before government forces retook control within weeks. Casualty estimates from the incident vary widely, from hundreds to thousands of people, and the aftermath triggered a sweeping military purge along with a new national security law used to suppress dissent across the entire country. Meanwhile, along the 38th parallel itself, the border was anything but quiet in the months before the supposed start of the war. Artillery exchanges, small unit raids, and skirmishes between North and South Korean forces occurred with real regularity throughout 1949, particularly around the Korean Peninsula, a contested strip of territory that would later become one of the flashpoints historians point to when debating exactly how the war's first hours unfolded. By the time June 1950 arrived, Korea was not a peaceful nation blindsided by an unprovoked attack. It was a nation already at war with itself, North and South, for years, with a body count in the tens of thousands, before a single North Korean tank crossed the parallel, in what the world would come to remember as the war's beginning. This is exactly the kind of evidence that gave rise to what's now called the Civil War thesis, most closely associated with the American historian Bruce Cummings, whose sprawling 2-volume study, The Origins of the Korean War, reshaped how scholars think about the conflict starting in the 1980s. Cummings argued that treating June 25, 1950 as the war's starting point fundamentally misunderstands what happened, because it frames an internal Korean struggle for reunification and legitimacy, one rooted in the trauma of Japanese colonialism and the chaotic post-war occupation, as though it were simply a chess move by Moscow. His central point was that it was Koreans who first shed blood in a struggle between South Korean communism and anti-communism, and that the roots of that bloodshed have to be found inside Korea itself, not solely in the diplomatic maneuvering of superpowers. This doesn't mean the international dimension didn't matter. It clearly did, as we're about to see. But it means the old picture of a peaceful, apolitical South Korea suddenly attacked out of a clear blue sky was, at minimum, an oversimplification, and at worst, a convenient piece of Cold War storytelling that obscured just how much violence the Southern government itself had already inflicted on its own population. Now, here's where the story gets its second major twist, because for decades, the opposite extreme was also being argued. If the traditionalist camp overstated Soviet control and understated Korean agency, an early wave of revisionist historians in the 1970s went the other direction entirely, some even suggesting the war might have started with a South Korean provocation, or that Kim Il-sung acted almost independently of Moscow. That debate raged in academic journals for years, largely because nobody outside the Kremlin actually had access to the internal Soviet decision-making. Both sides were arguing from incomplete information. And then, in 1994, that changed almost overnight. During a visit to Moscow in June 1994, Russian President Boris Yeltsin handed South Korean President Kim Young-sam a collection of 216 previously classified Soviet documents on the Korean War, spanning the years 1949 through 1953. These weren't summaries or memoirs written decades later with the benefit of hindsight and self-justification. These were the actual ciphered telegrams exchanged between Moscow and Pyongyang, between Moscow and Beijing, notes from private conversations among the key decision-makers, letters written by Kim Il-sung directly to Stalin, and formal resolutions of the Soviet Politburo itself. For the first time, historians could read Stalin's actual words instead of guessing at his intentions. And what those documents revealed was a far more cautious, far more calculated Stalin than either the traditionalist or the early revisionist camps had imagined. The transcripts show that as early as March 1949, in the historian Catherine Weathersby's words, far from approving any military campaign against the South. And again, for over a year, Stalin said no, worried that a premature attack would fail and could potentially drag the Soviet Union into direct conflict with the United States, at a moment when Moscow was not remotely prepared for that confrontation and was far more focused on consolidating its position in post-war Europe. Within weeks, that the United States would have no realistic opportunity to intervene before it was already over. Soviet advisors subsequently helped draft the actual battle plans for the invasion, and Stalin reportedly gave orders that all of Kim's requests for weapons and equipment be fulfilled quickly. Crucially, Stalin also insisted on final approval from Mao Zedong's newly established communist government in Beijing before he would let the operation proceed, in part so that if things went badly, China, not the Soviet Union, would bear the burden of bailing North Korea out. That is exactly what would happen a few months later, when American and United Nations forces pushed north toward the Chinese border, and Mao committed hundreds of thousands of troops to the fight. In other words, the war was not simply ordered top-down by an aggressive Kremlin looking to expand communism into Asia. Calculating gatekeeper who only opened the door once he was convinced the risk to the Soviet Union itself was minimal. Which brings us to one of the most persistent and most misunderstood pieces of the entire story. A single speech that has been blamed, fairly or unfairly, for practically causing the war on its own. On January 12, 1950, just months before the invasion, Secretary of State Dean Acheson stood before the National Press Club in Washington and outlined what he called America's defensive perimeter in the Pacific, the line of territory the United States was firmly committed to protecting by force. He described that perimeter as running through the Aleutians, Japan, and the Ryukyu Islands down to the Philippines. Notably absent from that list was South Korea. In the years following the invasion, this omission became one of the most repeated explanations for why the war happened at all. The theory holds that Acheson's speech signaled to the Soviet Union and North Korea that the United States would not defend South Korea if it were attacked, effectively handing Kim, Il-sung, and Stalin a green light. This argument found its most famous champion in Dwight Eisenhower, who, during his 1952 presidential campaign, accused the Truman administration of a political catastrophe, quoting Acheson's line that guaranteeing such areas against attack was hardly sensible or necessary. But the reality, once again, is considerably murkier than the popular version. First, there's a basic problem of timing and information. There was no official published transcript of Acheson's speech for weeks afterward, and both North Korean officials, and notably the New York Times, initially reported that South Korea had in fact been included within the American defense line. If the North Koreans themselves didn't come away from the speech believing Korea had been abandoned, it becomes very difficult to argue the speech was the decisive trigger for the invasion. Second, and more importantly, the newly declassified Soviet archives tell us Kim Il-sung had already been actively lobbying Stalin to approve an invasion for roughly a year before Acheson ever stepped up to that podium. The decision-making process was already well underway. Acheson's speech may well have reinforced Stalin's eventual calculation that American intervention was unlikely, and some scholars, including Bruce Cummings, have argued it played a genuine role in the broader climate of assumptions that led Stalin to finally say yes in April 1950. But treating it as the single spark that ignited an otherwise avoidable war gives one offhand line in one speech far more explanatory power than the actual documentary record supports. The invasion wasn't the result of one unguarded sentence. It was the product of over a year of calculated negotiation between Pyongyang, Moscow, and eventually Beijing. By early 1950, several things had shifted simultaneously. Mao Zedong's communists had just won the Chinese Civil War, giving the communist bloc in Asia a powerful new ally, and crucially, a huge pool of battle-hardened troops, including tens of thousands of ethnic Korean soldiers who had fought for Mao and could now be transferred back to Kim Il-sung's army, instantly professionalizing it. The Soviet Union had successfully tested its first atomic bomb the previous August. ending the American nuclear monopoly and reshaping Stalin's calculations about what risks were tolerable. And American troop withdrawals from South Korea, completed in mid-1949 under a policy that treated Korea as a low priority compared to Europe and Japan, left Rhee's government looking dangerously exposed, dependent on a South Korean military that was smaller, less equipped, and less experienced than the force massing across the border. Put all of that together, a newly powerful communist China willing to backstop the operation, a Soviet Union that no longer feared American nuclear blackmail quite as much, a South Korean army stripped of its American troop presence, and a North Korean leader who had spent a year insisting the war could be won in weeks, and Stalin's calculus finally tipped from no to yes. It wasn't one speech. It wasn't one betrayal. It was a convergence of geopolitical shifts that together made a fast, contained war look survivable. So, what did historians get wrong? Let's be specific. They got the starting date wrong. Treating June 25, 1950 as the beginning of the Korean War erases the Jeju Uprising, the Yosu Sunshin Rebellion, and years of border skirmishing that killed tens of thousands of Koreans and reveal the conflict as an escalation of an existing civil war, not a bolt from the blue. They got the border's origins wrong. The 38th parallel wasn't a natural, negotiated, or historically meaningful boundary. It was a line sketched onto a National Geographic map in about 30 minutes by two American colonels who had never set foot in Korea and admitted the choice made little sense geographically or economically. They got Stalin's role wrong, or at least oversimplified it dramatically. Declassified Soviet archives released in 1994 reveal a Stalin who resisted Kim Il-sung's repeated requests to invade for over a year, only relenting once Mao's backing, the new Soviet atomic capability, and assurances of a swift victory changed his risk assessment. This was not simply Moscow dispatching orders to an obedient satellite. It was a Korean leader driving the timeline, with a cautious superpower patron dragged along only when the odds looked favorable. And they got the Atchison's speech wrong, or at least badly overstated its importance. The idea that one omission in one January speech single-handedly invited an invasion doesn't hold up well against a documentary record showing that the invasion's planning was already well underway, and that even North Korean officials didn't initially interpret the speech as excluding South Korea from American protection at all. What emerges from all of this declassified evidence and revisionist scholarship is a picture far messier and honestly far more human than the old Cold War textbook version. The Korean War was not a single clean act of unprovoked aggression suddenly launched across a peaceful border. It was the explosive culmination of a civil conflict that had already been killing Koreans for years, layered on top of a hastily drawn colonial-era boundary line, accelerated by a determined regional leader who spent well over a year convincing a skeptical superpower patron to back his plan, and finally triggered by a convergence of global power shifts, a new communist ally in Beijing, a new bomb in Moscow's arsenal, and a withdrawal of American troops that none of the ordinary Korean civilians on either side of that line had any say in whatsoever. The war that followed would kill somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, flatten Pyongyang, devastate Seoul multiple times over, and leave a border that, more than 70 years later, remains the most heavily fortified in the world, with the two Koreas still officially at war, because no peace treaty was ever signed, only an armistice. And there's something uncomfortably familiar about how this story unfolded that goes beyond Korea itself. A border drawn without local input, hardening almost overnight into a line no one dared cross. A regional leader convinced his own ambitions were achievable and pressing a more powerful patron for the resources to pursue them. A great power calculating its own risk tolerance while treating the human cost to the people actually living on the ground as, at best, a secondary concern. None of that is unique to Korea in 1950. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in how post-colonial borders were drawn across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East in the 20th century, and in how distant powers have weighed the costs of the wars fought along those borders ever since. The Korean War is often called forgotten, but the forces that produced it were not unusual at all. They were and remain disturbingly ordinary. If you made it this far, drop a flag emoji in the comments, either flag. I'd genuinely love to see how many of you stuck around for the whole story. And if you're not subscribed yet, it really does help the channel more than you'd think. If you're interested in more deep dives that challenge the textbook version of history, I'd recommend checking out the video right here. I think you'll find it just as eye-opening. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.